Welcome everybody back to the youth panel discussion series that started yesterday with the presentation from our dear friend, John, and mine dear friend, Samir Claif. Yesterday we spoke about healthcare, vaccination, life after COVID, and we're going to touch upon these issues today again, perhaps from a slightly different angle. Before we dive into the world of politics in America and internationally, you heard this already, but for the sake of those who will be watching this at a later stage, Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development is Southeast Europe's #1 think tank, publishing #1 foreign policy magazine from our part of the world, for sure, the only one available on JSTOR. I won't spend too much time talking about the CIRSD. I'm sure all of you are familiar with our work, but what I'd like to emphasize again is that we do have a growing internship program. And as a matter of fact, this series was the idea of our able interns currently coming from all over the world, from Serbia, from US, from France, UK, and China. And today's Zoom is being followed by a carefully selected group of mostly students from our region, from Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Montenegro, but also some exceptional applicants who we felt like we have to include from the US, from Africa, from the Middle East, and Europe. So the commonality between all these is that they're all competent, promising, ambitious, and I'm sure that this is going to transpire in our conversation today, especially in the last half an hour, when you guys will be able to ask questions to John directly. I encourage you to type these questions before we start this last segment. So at any point in time, just type them out in the chat section of the Zoom. Tonight's guest is someone very special, and also very special to me personally, one of my best friends that I met for the first time 7 years ago. As a matter of fact, at the same occasion when I met Samir, and as I said last night, in one of those secret gatherings that we're not supposed to be speaking too much about, but that have been taking place over the past 7 years in places as diverse as America, Serbia, Denmark, Austria, Italy, you name it. We have built strong friendship, John and I. So it gives me particular pleasure to introduce his biography at the beginning. He is the CEO and president of the Rendon Group, a global strategic communications firm that worked in, believe it or not, more than 100 countries around the world. You heard me well, 100 countries. He served in the past as political director and also executive director of the Democratic Party of the United States. And he led numerous political campaigns on behalf of Democratic Party candidates in American elections. He's considered one of the world's leading pioneers in the use of strategic communications as an element of national power. He also served as an executive consultant to the White House as well as to the Pentagon. He was lecturing in various academic institutions around the world. He was teaching at Harvard. He was teaching at Defense Academy of the United Kingdom, amongst many other academic institutions. He is, as I said, a dear friend with a very particular sense of humor that I find very appealing, and I think you might be exposed to some of it this evening. I certainly look forward to that. But John, I wish you a warm welcome to Serbia, this time virtually, unlike the last time when you visited us in Belgrade a few years ago. My friend, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everybody online. I do have a PowerPoint because in the United States, PowerPoint has become a form of literacy. And so I'll begin with that, assuming this all works. So let's see what happens, or I'll just come back and talk to you for about 3.5 days. So I need you to activate screen sharing.
Can you activate screen sharing? I think the screen sharing is being activated at this moment. Can you use it?
I'll let you know shortly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we
So
can.
that works.
Yeah.
Can you all see that?
Yes, we can see that. This PowerPoint presentation is going to be around 20 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. Then John and I will be talking for about 35 minutes, and then the last 30 minutes are reserved for your questions.
So thanks very much, and off we go. So the interesting challenge with respect to the pandemic was that I don't know, I would think now 2000, so 20 years ago, the world was confronted with the only scheduled crisis known in our history, Y2K. And coming out of that, a number of people, particularly technologists and scientists, said the collaboration that occurred in Y2K should be brought forward because we may be faced with a global pandemic. And different governments said at that time, no, we'll be able to handle that. It's not a problem. Of course, you can't find any of those people right now. But when we looked at the pandemic, and I think I'm coming up in the discussion on the pandemic now in the 14th month. I was in the first discussion I was in December of 19. And we began to look at the pandemic through the optics, 3 different silos, if you will. And that first silo that got our attention was really about prevention, which is about vaccination. And I'm going to talk about each one. Now, progress has been made on the vaccines. You know, as I shared with your colleague, I got my second shot yesterday in Moderna. I have no effects from it. Even the arm is not that sore. So I'm pretty optimistic. We're seeing an increase in the production levels. We're seeing an increase in distribution globally. And there will be more vaccines in the market by the summer, June, July. And I think everybody who wants to be vaccinated will be able to be vaccinated. The big breakthrough is obviously Johnson & Johnson, which is not a cold chain vaccine. And it only requires 1 shot. And that will make a difference for developing countries. The second thing we tended to look at was really about testing. So the challenge in the conversations in which I participated is testing was basically months out when the pandemic took off, and it had to shift from 3 months to 3 weeks to 3 days to 3 hours, and basically to 3 minutes. And there's some really good progress now. I took a briefing 2 weeks ago with a venture capital firm that's going to invest in a company that has saliva-based 2-minute tests. So if that can actually do it, and then they can produce to scale, that'll be a game changer. Also, about 6 weeks ago, one of the most fascinating aspects was at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute for Technology. They drove artificial intelligence together with a handheld device, which I think is no longer a device. I think for the next generation, it's an appendage of your soul. But what they have configured is using artificial intelligence, people can call a specific number anywhere in the world, read a specific sentence, and the algorithm will be able to detect respiratory distress in asymptomatic individuals. And that would be a way to find people who have the virus that have not been vaccinated and get them immediately into the vaccination queue or get them into the treatment queue. So that too is a game changer. And when I discussed this with people in the global health community, they were quick to point out, to their credit, that there were a number of companies, in fact, I think a total of 6, that were working on the voice-based algorithm. So to me, that was extremely encouraging. And then we go to the third silo, which is really about treatment. And on treatment, I will tell you that there's some significant breakthroughs because people, the healthcare community, have learned about the virus. And what they've learned is early intervention makes a big difference. And so that's the combination of testing and treatment, which is why fewer people are on ventilators in the second and third wave than were a year ago in the first wave. And so coming out of this now, we're actually based in a race between the vaccine and the variants. And so far, all the vaccines are holding up to all the variants, but it's entirely possible that a variant will develop that will require, so I've had 2 shots that may require me to get a 3rd shot. But right now we don't see that. We just know that that's a potential threat. But here are some big points to get to. Next slide, please, slide 6. As you can see this, right? Slide 6. Can you see slide 6?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Okay. So the reality is, in times of great disruption, which clearly would be a global pandemic, there are opportunities for dynamic change. So this virus has changed how we work. It's changed how we play. And it's changed the way we live. Now, going to slide 7, I'm going to talk this through a little bit through 5 different domains. So I'll talk about healthcare, education, work, hospitality, and retail. Next slide, which is slide 8. Healthcare, for the most part in the West, and particularly in the United States, is built on a foundation of treating illness and injury. It is not built on a foundation of wellness or prevention. The pandemic will drive healthcare in the direction of wellness and prevention, which will create whole new businesses that so far have not been contemplated. Distant socialization, which is what we're doing right now, will become the norm and the first triage of a visit to a doctor. Also, the revenue models associated with medicine will begin to shift in the direction of wellness and prevention. Think about how crazy it is that anybody has to pay a doctor to be treated because they're sick and not to pay a doctor to keep them healthy. The next one, next slide, please, 9, is education. The pandemic has totally disrupted education from lower grades to medium grades to high school to university and postgraduate degrees. The revenue models associated with higher education will dramatically change. For example, one of the schools I have lectured at over the years is the Haas Business School at Berkeley, and they were contemplating increasing the size of their classes by a factor of 3, so 3x greater number of students, reducing tuition by a factor of 2, and only requiring people to be on campus 1 month in the course of a year. So you'd rotate through and they're sampling different models. Candidly, I haven't checked in with them recently to see how they're approaching the next year, but it will be interesting to see what they do as everything begins to open up. The third dynamic associated with this is work. Um, so, as Vuk mentioned, um, we've worked in or on over 100 countries. I think the last count was 127. So we've been a distributed workforce before distributed workforce was an acceptable part of the lexicon. But I think a series of large enterprises, law firms, accountancies, think about Price Waterhouse, think about Accenture, think about McKinsey. They're all discovering that a distributed workforce is more productive than a centralized workforce. And what that may mean is large office buildings that have many companies in them in downtown cities will have many vacancies. But what it also means is that people will not be required to come to an office to work, that in some environments you can come in, it's called hoteling, where you schedule a person to be on a specific day. They own that slot, they can give that slot up, but they can be in the office for like 3 or 4 hours only. The use of conference rooms for meetings will disappear. It'll be a single place where somebody can conduct a Zoom or a Signal call or a Teams or Wicker. And then the next one is hospitality. Um, so this has changed dramatically. We all know restaurants that closed. We know bars that closed. Um, the companies that began to deliver food from restaurants to homes, which was much more apparent in the rest of the world than in the United States, those companies that do delivery have been going through nonstop hiring since probably for the last 9 months. And the restaurants are seeing a shift in their revenue from people dining in to people getting delivery or taking out. And I think the model of hospitality will shift a little bit. And there'll be some creative aspects to hospitality, but it's going to be different coming out of this. And then obviously one of the biggest changes, and we see this every single day in major cities around the world, and that's what retail is about. Stores are in trouble. And they were in trouble before the pandemic. Vuk, you know that when we see each other in New York around the UNGA, UN General Assembly meeting every year, I've got different meetings with different heads of government as Vuk does. And I use it as an opportunity to get my 25,000 or 30,000 steps in. And I remember in 2019 being in New York, walking from, let's just say, probably around 42nd Street all the way up to 72nd or 73rd Street. It's a healthy walk, but I walked up Madison Avenue, which is sort of the retail store environment of the world. And every single block there were vacancies. Every single block there were vacancies. And I knew then that retail stores were in trouble, and the pandemic just finished them off. So they moved online. Probably before the pandemic, the words I would hate the most when I was out shopping, either for exercise or for friends, is when a salesperson would say to me, "I'm sorry, only available online." Well, now everything is available online. And Amazon, Federal Express, UPS, DHL, they're all scaling their workforces in order to get more delivery. And I do not see that changing. So somebody's got to rethink what the retail experience looks like from a personal dimension. But those are 5 areas that will be dramatically changed, in my humble opinion, by the pandemic coming out of it. And at that point, at the 22-minute mark, Minister, I turn it back to you.
Well, thank you very much, John. You mentioned vaccination. You got your vaccine. I'm still waiting to get mine. I signed up, and I'm expecting. I'm expecting it any day, or maybe in a week from now. Serbia has done reasonably well when it comes to vaccination, largely due to the fact that our government decided to play a big gamble, to make a gamble with the Chinese Sinopharm vaccine. Essentially, agreed to be a country for third stage testing, and as a result of it, got a massive supply of Chinese vaccines. So we're probably amongst the top few in Europe and perhaps even in the world when it comes to the percentage of people who get vaccinated. Now, I'm going to ask you a question about vaccination that has to do with geopolitics. Uh, People start talking about vaccine diplomacy. There were mask diplomacy or PPE diplomacy at the beginning of this crisis, and China sent massive amounts of the PPE equipment as aid to especially poor countries around the world, and they appear to be doing the same with the vaccine right now. And since vaccination is going to become an essential part of whether and when we come to some kind of normality, it looks as if China is really quite ahead of the United States when it comes to vaccine diplomacy, being ready to supply at zero cost or at very limited cost vaccines around the world. Do you expect the United States in the foreseeable future, in the near future, to join this race? Do you expect the United States to also start helping, especially poor countries around the world, with Pfizer and the JJ and Moderna, or do you think it's a far-fetched thing?
So I'm going to answer that question, and then after that, I have a question for you. We watched PPE as the first issue in the pandemic, personal protective equipment, become a race between the boys in Beijing and the rest of the world. And with that came a lot of counterfeit equipment. So the first conclusion I would draw, to which I would attach vaccines, is I can see a move coming out of this to make personal protective equipment and the ability to either create or acquire vaccines part of every country's critical infrastructure. So what about vaccine diplomacy? It's a great question. In reality, at a political level, unless you are an authoritarian state, every state should make sure its citizens, regardless of age, are vaccinated before they distribute vaccines overseas. That makes sense. The challenge with the boys in Beijing, in a number of countries where they've distributed it, it has privately been administered to the elite in the government before it has reached the citizens. And I think that's contributing to the tension currently in Peru, but I haven't checked in with them recently to see if the vaccine that created the problem was actually one of the Chinese Sinovacs. So I'm going to go, you've raised a really good question. I'll go back and check that out before using that as an example. But my question for you before we go to the next thing is, and I don't know if your colleagues realize this or not, but you had an extraordinarily successful run to become Secretary General of the United Nations, barely finishing second. And I should actually call you General, I guess. So that election's coming up again. And you had a range of support out of every single regional caucus in the world. It was very impressive, particularly to those of us in the United States. so I'm going to put you on the spot. You're going to run again for Secretary General?
A great question, John.
I get lucky.
So basically, now I know that my first question to you was a tough one, because thank you for this counter question. I'm currently in Serbia, and I'm not going to say Serbia first because this has certain connotations when it comes to global and U.S. politics in particular. But right now, I'm focused on my work in Serbia, and I don't know. One day, maybe after we sort out our difficulties in Serbia, I may look outward again. I think that that's probably as much as I can say at this stage. But now I'm going to ask you another difficult question because we seem to be doing really well in putting each other on spot. I'm going to ask you another question about U.S. and China, not about a vaccine diplomacy, but globally. Uh, in 10 years from now, in 2030, end of this decade, we are at the beginning of the decade. In 2030, do you expect the US-China relationship to be more or less tense than it is right now?
So that's an excellent question, and I like your framing because it's got strategic content. The hardest dynamic, and you and I have shared some of these conversations, over the past decade, but the hardest thing is when policymakers look for an answer in the next 10 minutes. And the fact that you're willing to get your horizon up to 10 years is exactly what we encourage people in every government to do when confronted with what would be known in our system as a wicked hard problem. So in 10 years, I believe the relationship between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China will be warm, collaborative, and structurally competitive. I think you will begin to see the evolution of that policy under Biden, but it will not finish during the Biden administration. It will depend a lot on what the next government is and how they build on what will be a Biden administration policy. There is no doubt across the United States government that Beijing poses a threat to the United States specifically and to the West in general. But there's also recognition in the United States and in the West that China as a nation is ascending. It's growing. It's not going to go away. And what Beijing fears more than anything else is not the United States. It's not Russia. It's not Korea. It's not Japan. The boys in Beijing fear the people of their own country more than they fear anything else. And therein lies the connection that the United States can make and other Western countries can make.
Wow. So you were actually amongst the very few optimists that I had recently talked to when it comes to this. Most recently, I talked to my old professor, Graham Allison from Harvard, who is the big supporter of this Thucydides trap theory when it comes to the US-China relationship. And since it is very obvious that China is catching up very fast with the United States on most fronts, for example, in terms of the size of the economy, the projections are that 2028 is going to be the year when China overtakes the United States as the largest economy in the world. Lots of developments on the technological front, communications, AI, and so on and so forth, that also has China with a great momentum in terms of this bilateral competition. But one field where I know you are a big expert, and this is military. Of course, the United States is by far the most superior military power, probably the most superior one in the world in terms of comparison with other rivals. China is working also on that front as well. Now, do you expect that, for example, us here on this call, and some people here are as young as 19 years old. So do you expect that in our lifetime, China is going to be able to catch up with the United States on the military front?
So good question also, and your professor is also a very good friend of mine. So we have disagreed and agreed over the years, such as the space of academia, as you know so well.
Yeah.
So part of the challenge of this, and I want to frame this correctly, because I think for too long people have looked at this wicked challenge incorrectly. So it's, if we talk about China and the United States, we should be talking about the Chinese people and the American people. And I think that relationship will be enduring in its value. The tension will become between Beijing and Washington, which is government to government. And in that case, there are some people, and this may include Graham, that have characterized the wicked problem of Beijing as the new Cold War. Ironically, that's an incorrect characterization from my perspective, because in the Cold War between the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, there was no interface across the dime spectrum: diplomatic, information, military, and economic. No interface, head to head in every single one of those silos. With respect to Beijing and the broader Chinese environment, the West in totality, and the United States in particular, has relationships across the entire dime spectrum, including the military. What is very evident in China, which is part of their challenge, and the reason they have to steal intellectual property, is they lack the ability to create and innovate on their own. I think that is one of the byproducts of communist systems, is it removes individual creativity, and that makes it harder. So in order to accelerate and maintain velocity in a growing country, they have to steal in order to stay ahead. And that will eventually they'll have a population that can create on its own, and that will become a threat to the centers of power in Beijing. Mm-hmm. So on a military side, we're collaborating and competing at the same time. And I guess I should point out, these are John's views. I don't speak for the United States government, other governments, planets, or solar systems. Mm-hmm. Although there are a couple that want me to. That's a different discussion.
Be there, and I know that you're in frequent touch with quite a number of the leaders of governments and militaries.
Of other planets too.
Other planets, yeah. Well, I'm going to stay with this question because you have this great military background, understanding of military working as a civilian with military leaders. Could you describe to me a scenario that worries you most as an expert in this field, that leads to an escalation of hostilities somewhere in the world that ends up with a major military conflict that involves the United States? So what's the scenario of that sort that worries you most?
The inability to understand motivations. Mm-hmm. You get accidental escalation and somebody misreads something.
For instance?
Now, well, we had an incident around Ukraine with the Russians and NATO several years ago, where there were shots actually fired across a border. And if it wasn't for sound commanders not returning fire, that could have spiraled out of control. You had the incident in the Black Sea again with Ukraine, with the bridge and the local vessels that were taken by the Russians. It is essential in diplomacy, and you know this because you did an extraordinary job, not only as a foreign minister of Serbia, but also as the president of the General Assembly. You know, the key to diplomacy is to have an ability to have a conversation when that conversation is really hard. And the essence of diplomacy is to work the relationship before the relationship needs to be worked.
Mm-hmm.
You can't surge trust, period. And it is not reading the other side correctly that creates something that could spiral out of control. We watched, as a whole world watched, the border tensions between Beijing and Delhi in a specific area that broke out into a fist fight. If the command and control of nuclear weapons was different than it is, would that have resulted in the launch of a tactical nuclear weapon? Who knows? Both sides got them.
But this is very interesting because you're talking about this ability to communicate and to diffuse, and the most famous moment of the Cold War in terms of U.S. and the Soviet Union coming to one step away from a nuclear confrontation was in Cuba, and there were movies about it, Kennedy and Khrushchev and the blockade, and they established a red line, a red telephone from the White House to the Kremlin after this crisis, so that there's a way to communicate if there is a crisis. Is there like anything similar to the red line, to the red phone?
The hotline.
The hotline.
Yeah. So there are a number of them. Their presence is classified. I can talk about one publicly because it was the subject of news coverage sometime in the 2000 range. So I really don't remember which year. I'm going to say 2007 because that's sort of in the middle of that range. There was a near nuclear incident. So this begins with, and anybody who is an engineer or an astrophysicist or loves Star Trek as much as I do will know this right away. So when a satellite degrades and becomes space debris, as it enters the Earth's atmosphere, at the point it passes through the burn stage, it looks virtually identical to a missile at apogee. Mm-hmm. So what that means is if somebody launched a rocket, an intercontinental ballistic missile, and it goes up and then it comes down, the moment it starts coming down, the image of that on radar is virtually identical to space junk entering the Earth's atmosphere. And in the mid-2000s, there was a satellite degrading and a warning message went out because it looked like it was going to come down over India and Pakistan, which would have meant that both sides would have thought the other side had launched. And the reflexive action is they would have launched. Turns out it degraded a few seconds earlier than it looked, came out over the Med, never passed over there, but it changed the policy in Pakistan. At that time, Pakistan's release authority for nuclear weapons was resident in the forward commander, not back in Islamabad and not back with the president or the head of the army. And you never want to have that release authority forward because they're always going to be missing intelligence. They're going to have a tactical view on what's happening around them, but you don't want them to call in a nuclear strike. So a hotline was set up between Islamabad and Delhi for any future incidents like that. Mm-hmm. Other hotlines that exist, I believe, are still classified, but I'm sure how brilliant everybody on this call is. They're soon going to be using the fountain of all knowledge, Wikipedia, and see what other hotlines exist just to be able to answer the question. So I'm counting on the next generation to be smarter than I.
Thanks, John. I'm going to ask you the next question about Europe and its relationship with the United States. transatlantic relations in general. And a few days ago, there was a very warm Munich Security Conference virtual meeting, and Joe Biden who is speaking, and Angela Merkel and other leaders as well, talking about the renewed commitment to transatlanticism after Trump and so on and so forth. And but on the other side, a few days ago, Biden signed certain executive orders related to to the um, the money that was infused into the American economy to support the big $2 trillion package, and specified that can be used only for American goods and so on and so forth, so that the American corporations actually are the main beneficiaries. And a lot of people said, well, this is, again, America first, but just in a slightly more civilized manner communicated to the world. Also, a lot of people in Europe are saying, well, after this very traumatic experience of Donald Trump in terms of its relationship, of US relationship with Europe, we never know. You see how crazy American politics is. And maybe 4 years down the road after Joe Biden, we may have another Trump or somebody of that sort. So maybe we want to build our own independent capacities, because we may not have United States as a reliable ally in the future. What do you say to that? What is your projection of the transatlantic relationship in the 2020s?
So I think the transatlantic relationship is foundational to U.S. policy. But as I've said to people in Europe and elsewhere, the reality is the Atlantic Alliance is the last vestige of the 20th century. The Pacific Alliance is the first vestige of the 21st century. More people live in an ellipse that takes in China, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia, than live outside that ellipse. That's where people are. And if somebody's going to be producing retail products, consumer products, that's a potential market. But to evaluate the relationship, one would have to evaluate it across that dime spectrum that I mentioned: diplomatic, information, military, and economic. And we do have shared values with Europe. We have a shared vision for what rule of law looks like and why it matters. We have a shared vision about what democracy means and what it doesn't mean. And we have a shared vision about what empowering citizens to make decisions on their own lives, about their government, about the rules and regulations under which they function, and about their own set of opportunities. That shared vision is not going to go away. That shared vision does not exist with all the countries in Asia at the moment the way it exists with many countries in Europe. So I can see an increased focus in the Pacific based on the foundation with Europe. I don't see Europe going away, even in global climate crisis. But the future is about the Pacific. And I think everybody in Europe realizes that too, when one looks at the trade relationships that are going east and west.
And do you envisage, having said that, had you envisaged that in this decade, or maybe in the next decade, we are going to have the Pacific Treaty Organization? Like,
So, we had one of those very close around the Vietnam War. It was called SEATO, the South East Asia Treaty Organization.
mhm.
And post-Vietnam, that went away. Do I think there'll be something comparable? Haven't really thought about it. You're beginning to see signs of that without name,
Mm-hmm.
in
Everything, yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, our command, the United States Military Command responsible for the Pacific, changed its name from the United States Pacific Command to the United States Indo-Pacific Command about 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a recognition, but that's only in the military domain. I mean, It would need to have a political committee. You have ASEAN, you have APEC, um, and you have legitimate questions about how the United States will stay in an agreement once an agreement's made, based on the 4 years we've just come out of.
So it is, of course, going to depend a lot on American politics. So I'm going to ask you a few questions about the American politics because you are an expert on domestic.
Well, not an expert, but why not?
Well, you used to be the political director of one of the two parties in the United States. With your background and with your knowledge about what is currently going on in American politics, what is your guess? What are the top three things that Joe Biden worries about when he wakes up in the morning?
So the three things that the president would worry about in terms of the United States or in terms of the world?
In general, both US and the world.
Yeah, so clearly the first issue is the global climate crisis. That's the first issue on his plate. It's the reason he took a very good friend of his, good friend of mine,
John Kerry,
Secretary Kerry, and made him the special presidential envoy for the climate. This is a real issue. It's not a political issue. It's a real issue. And it needs to work, as the Secretary and I have talked, it's got to be worked both from the top down, which is about national leadership and global leadership. It has to be worked from the bottom up. Until people make a material change in the lives they lead and how they consume products, whether they're retail products or food products, you're not going to get a significant change at scale. But once it starts happening, it can go to scale pretty quickly. But we should take it very seriously. I talked about this a couple days ago because of the tragedies in Texas. We noticed over a decade ago that storms that were forming in different locations than they had previously. They were lasting longer when they hit land. They were more intense and they were larger. So this ice storm that paralyzed Texas was in Texas and in Maine at exactly the same time. It ran the entire width of the United States. A hurricane we watched last year covered the entire state of Florida and South Carolina, half of Georgia, at exactly the same time. These are monster storms, and they're all coming as a result of an unstable environment. If we don't focus on the climate now, and it's not about getting votes, it's about saving lives. That's, I think, his primary issue. His second issue will be, I'm not trying to diminish a domestic issue. Third issue is human rights. We have seen a surge in authoritarian regimes globally that have established enough credibility where the deprivation of human rights in their own country is now an accepted norm by most countries. President Biden, Vice President Harris will make human rights the foundational issue, along with climate, in what the U.S. foreign policy will be for the next 4 years.
So that's probably not the music to everybody's ears here in Serbia, but it's certainly something that is encouraging for those who pay premium. Really find democracy and human rights as an important issue. But the issue number two that you just barely touched upon is politics, like domestic politics.
Well, so I'm going to take you. You asked me the three things that I thought kept the president up at night, or that he's thinking about in the morning, and the third one is the divide in the country.
Divide. So that's what I was about to ask you.
Yeah, and we have to be honest about this divide. So there was an insurrection on January 6th at the United States Capitol. And I remember commenting to a number of friends that the entire government of the United States and the American people stared into the abyss and the abyss stared back. We all own a piece of what happened on January 6th. We own it because we did not confront somebody when they made up information that was not true. I mean, in my work in the information domain, I tell people quite frequently that facts are pieces of information that are picked up and moved along. But a fact can only have one of two characteristics. It can either be a true fact or it can be a false fact. It cannot be an alternative fact. There is no such thing. And what has transpired in the United States is the country has been divided on either side. And we wonder why 70 plus million people voted for Trump after everything we knew. And that's because we knew it and they did not. They get different news. They talk about the issues differently. And they can't understand why 80 million plus people voted for Joe Biden, because they can't understand it. It must have been stolen. And now we have to work our way back. And part of the challenge, I was one of the few people, you'll remember this, in 16, I was one of the few people that told folks that I could see Trump winning. And I could see Trump winning, and I characterized it afterwards because we've had this long-standing economic theory in the Democratic Party in particular, which is when the economy gets better, it gets better for everybody. It's known as a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, that only works if you have water. And vast portions of the United States did not benefit from the economic recovery that we had in Obama, that was started by the Obama-Biden administration and benefited Trump and Pence when they came in. But because it doesn't affect everybody, nobody believes it exists. And then, what happened is we allowed issues to be politicized. And in that politicization, we lost our sense of community. Somebody has a flat tire, you stop and help them. You don't check out their bumper stickers to see what side of the divide they're on. You help them out because they're in need. If somebody doesn't have enough food to feed their family, you deliver food to the house. You don't ask them if they're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent or a Martian, different planet, but the reality is we've lost that sense of community, and now we have to build it back. And we have to recognize and respect, and this is essential. We have to recognize and respect that people hold divergent political views on a wide range of issues. And yet, even though they're different than us, they exist on this planet, and we share the same air, the same land, and we have the same hopes and aspirations and the same fears. And we need to recognize and respect and engage them in a conversation about the future. And as Roger Fisher and Bill Urey wrote in their seminal piece, Negotiating to Yes, we have to stop facing each other across the table, and we have to sit on the same side of the table and confront the problem and not confront each other. In essence, the country has to go through couples counseling.
Well, but this is very, very, very valiant way of looking at things. But reality of the U.S. politics is that with a Senate that is evenly divided, every single small slip could mean great difficulties when it comes to governance of Biden administration. And the latest, I'm not sure if it's fatality yet, but certainly a big obstacle for appointment of Neera Tanden as a high-level member of the cabinet. And Neera Tanden was one of our previous guests in this series, and we were all elated when Biden nominated her to be the director for budget in the White House. But a couple of days ago, one Democratic senator said, well, I'm not voting for her. And since there are 50 Republican senators and votes are almost exclusively bipartisan these days, it looks like it's going to be extremely difficult for Joe Biden to govern without paying extraordinary amount of attention to domestic issues, which then can spill into foreign policy making. So are you an optimist that this bitter partisan division of today can be overcome in the foreseeable future? And my follow-up question to that is, do you think it's realistic that Donald Trump is going to run again for the president of the United States?
So first off, I would tell you that I'm not an optimist. I'm a youthful optimist.
Yeah.
Okay. And yeah, I'm optimistic about the country because I have been fortunate enough to work elections and politics in every single state. And I know something about the American people, whether they live in South Dakota or South Carolina. Um, I've had conversations with them about their hopes, their dreams, their fears. And if we can get the American people into the discussion, we can solve this divide a lot easier. It's important to realize that the voices that shout the loudest tend on either side of the extreme, whether they're super left or super right, they don't represent the body politic. They just represent the audio meter, the volume. And so I am optimistic about the country. Governing is tough. The one thing I'll say about President Biden is he is not a creature of the executive branch, despite spending 8 years as President Obama's vice president. He's a creature of the United States Congress. That's where he spent almost 30 years. And he has an opportunity at this point in time, because of everything that's going on before him and everything that's coming, he could be the Lyndon Johnson of this generation. So he's not gonna win every vote that he sends up to the Congress. He's also not going to lose every vote he sends up to the Congress. And sometimes, and I learned this early in my career, if it's a career, if you can call it a career, from Mr. O'Neill, who was Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. He said the most important thing to realize is that a no is more valuable than a yes.
Wow, that's Tip O'Neill. He also said all politics is local.
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken.
And he got that from John Kennedy when Kennedy was president.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you my last question before handing over to our students, and I see several of them haven't raised their hands. So my last question is COVID-19, the pandemic, and everything that came out of the pandemic was an ultimate Black Swan event. I remember in January of this year, of last year, when everybody gathered in Davos and talked about climate change and other issues, and not a single discussion was devoted to COVID. And even very few side conversations were held about COVID. And by the way, Wuhan was already locked up and so on and so forth. So COVID is like a phenomenal example of a Black Swan event that can change everything overnight. Now, Black Swan is by definition something that you cannot predict. But I am nevertheless going to ask you to use your imagination and your experience to say what could be a Black Swan event of the 2020s after COVID, something that not a lot of people are thinking about, yet something that can happen and totally shake up and change everything that is going on in the world.
A near miss by an asteroid or a meteor.
A near miss.
Yeah, if it hits, it's definitely going to change everything.
Yeah.
But a near miss, and I have eclectic conversations, as you know, right? So I remember talking to some astronauts 2 decades ago who posited that would be the big existential threat after the environment, would be something coming at us. And they argued for the time, first for detection and second for engagement. And this really comes down to astrophysics, right? Mm-hmm. So detection is making sure that we have 360-degree visibility at the greatest possible distance on both the horizontal and vertical axis, so we can see anything headed our way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The second thing is, if it's headed our way in a threat-based vector, you want to hit it or more accurately, you want to nudge it as far away from Earth as possible. Because the further out you are, the easier and softer the nudge has to be. But that requires people investing in that. Now, is it possible that we come out of the pandemic and we decide to create, a scientific domain in parallel to, under, or separate from the United Nations that deals with scientific threats? Yeah, I think that's possible. But as the start of my talk mentioned, we had this very discussion in the year 2000, coming out of Y2K, when everybody shared information to prevent it, and we weren't smart enough to keep it going. And the challenge with Davos and Wuhan being locked down while everybody was having a great conversation there, I think back. I mean, my first warning that got to me on COVID was the first week in December of the previous of 19. And nobody was paying attention in the system. And that made me wonder, how isolated is the leadership from, what really are threats? And, could the respective systems sort of have a global warning order where leaders know, hey, we're tracking this one potential threat, you should know something about it, rather than have it work its way up through everybody's individual intelligence system? But I don't know what will happen to that. Anyway, happy to open it up to.
Thank you. So now I'm going to open up the floor to our students. They sent in a number of questions already. And the first question is by Ernad Spahic. So will somebody unmute?
Do you hear me?
Yeah, so before you go, let me just say this about questions. Invariably, what happens in a session like this is we don't get to everybody's question. So here's a commitment I'll make, just because I believe in the minister's leadership and in the foundation. If we don't get to your question, send it by email and I will respond in writing.
Thank you so much, John. And before I give the floor to Ernad, Samir actually sent me a WhatsApp message last night saying that the same applies for him. So if there are any questions that you want to ask either John or Samir, please send it to us and we're gonna make sure it gets answered. But now, Erna, the floor is yours.
Thank you for great lesson today. I have a question for Mr. Rendon. What are your expectations? If we are vaccinated with Chinese or Russian vaccine, will we be able to travel to the countries of Western world? Thank you.
So, thanks for the question. Not an area of expertise I have. I can get you the answer. Part of the challenges on some of the Chinese vaccines, and you have to guard against counterfeit vaccines, which are now entering the market, pretending to be Chinese or pretending to be Russian. I'm hearing good things about the Sputnik vaccine rather. So what you want to do is ask the central governing authority to release the test results. But if you want, I will be on a call Saturday, and I will ask what they think of both Sputnik and Sinovac, and then I'll respond with that.
Great.
Okay.
So thanks, John. The next question goes to Anya Popovic. Anya, are you unmuted?
Yes, hello. Mr. Rendon, you mentioned that facts are very important and we see a big divide currently. And my question is, what are your stands on censorship and what the role of big tech is in it?
Yeah, so I'm really not a big fan of censorship, period. I think we're all better off if we can freely debate ideas, because I think there's much to learn from each other, even if we disagree with the other people. I'm also a big believer, if I believe in freedom of speech and I believe in freedom of assembly and I believe in freedom and I believe in liberty, then I should believe in the strength of my arguments and not try to censure a point of view which is different than my own. I learned early enough in one of the first jobs I had that, and this was working for a cabinet secretary in Massachusetts in the state, that we would discuss policy at the table. So I'd have to come with my arguments. But if my argument didn't prevail, I should come with better arguments next time. I think we also should encourage everybody to understand the value of critical thinking and actually debate the other side, not debate with the other side, take the other side's issue and try to argue the merits of that issue. In arguing the merits of an opposing issue, you will learn that issue's vulnerability, and then you'll be able to make the argument in the open. But I'm against censorship, period.
Great, same here, but not everybody would agree with you from Serbia when you say this. Now, the next question goes to George Ponoš. Can we unmute George?
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can.
Hello? Okay, awesome. So my question concerns the schismatic nature of the Democratic and Republican parties. The Democratic Party has a neoliberal core, like an old guard, like Pelosi, Biden, etc. And now they have these more leftist, younger individuals like AOC, Tlaib, and Omar, who have different understandings and different policies. And the same problem is also in the Republican Party now, because we had the Mitch McConnells, the Romneys, and now we are seeing the America Firster candidates, primarily in Congress, not yet in the Senate as much. But recently, Donald Trump has said that he will support America First primary challengers against Mitch McConnell in particular, but probably against others as well, those who broke party line to try and convict him in the impeachment trial. So what do you think will be the future for these parties? Which of these waves will prevail?
Thank you.
So I have a really good question. So thank you for that. I've been to this movie before. I've been in discussions about the death of the Democratic Party after the large loss in 1972. And, you know, the loss after 1988. So 2 Reagan terms, Bush won. And I've watched the discussion of the death of the Republican Party after they've been wiped out in elections in the Congress. So predicting the death of a political party is normal. Seeing how it struggles with its internal tensions, that'll be what comes out of it. I would kid people when I talk about politics. One of the first things I learned about the Democratic Party is that it's really not an organized political party. So when we said to them, you now have an assignment, please create a firing squad. The first formation the party did was to stand in a circle. Now, what that means is it would rather shoot itself than shoot the enemy. So that requires extraordinary political skills to make sure that from the extreme sides of the party, that they have a voice. But it's also important to realize their voice is not representative of the party as a whole. It's a representative of the party as a part of the party. Most number of people elected in the year 2018 that enabled the House to go Democratic were moderate Democrats who get no attention whatsoever. And because, again, you can't equate volume of voice to support levels. And that's true on the Republican side, too. It's not a surprise that President Trump would say he's going to field a candidate against Mitch McConnell, because Mitch McConnell's not going to run again. He's got a 6-year term. He's going to try to take the Senate back. If he gets it back, he's going to keep it, and then he's going to retire. So he's got no threat from Trump. but the party's got to reason its way out. And there's part of, I mean, the Republicans have to reason their way through from reasonable Republicans to extreme elements in their party. And they're going to do that over, you know, they're going to struggle through it, just like Democratic Party did. We dealt with it coming out of the 12 years of the Reagan-Bush period by creating an organization called the Democratic Leadership Conference. And I was fortunate to be one of the 3 people involved in its creation. I think the Republicans will do the same thing, but I don't think the Democrats will because Biden's in office. So thanks.
Now, I'm going to get you back to the question that I asked, but I'm not sure if you answered it directly. Do you think?
I didn't answer it.
So do you think Donald Trump is going to run for president of the United States again?
So the question is whether I think he's going to run in his own head or run on a ballot. Which one?
Whichever way. Do you think he's going to try and run again?
No.
But he's still very strong and
He
influential.
derives strength from visibility. The less visibility he has, the less strength he has. So the more people talk about him, the stronger he gets. When fewer people talk about him, he becomes weak.
And then there's
he's understood that his entire career.
Yeah, but then now this comes to the issue. It comes back to the issue of censorship and tech giants, Twitter in particular. So that will be very, very interesting thing to follow. Now the next question goes to the Alawi Al-Hakan.
Alawi Al-Hakan.
Alawi Al-Hakan. Sorry, I
Yeah.
apologize
Yes.
for pronouncing it badly.
Well, thank you for an amazing seminar. Firstly, I have a little bit of a political question. After the change of the US administration, why is the newly elected president, Joe Biden, refusing the US to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal? So that is my question to Mr. Rendon.
Thanks.
So again, just a reminder that I don't speak for the government of the United States, but I will give you my instinct, which is just that, instinct, not knowledge. I believe that the dynamic that is underway, it falls within the domain of trust but verify, and that there will be a series of trust building measures on both sides that begin with the report of the IAEA, which has just left Iran, if I remember correctly. And you'll see this discussion emerge. And I do think it's possible to get them back in to the agreement and then move from the agreement outward to other issues that are problematic.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it's a decision not to go back. It's a decision on how to go back.
I have a sub question.
I'm gonna ask a follow-up question. I am going to use my privilege as a moderator as a follow-up question to this, but I promise you're gonna like it because it's very controversial what I'm gonna ask in the same context.
Is this where I say you're breaking up? No, go ahead.
Oh, so basically, John, can you imagine the situation in which you wake up one morning, turn on the TV, and you learn through news networks that Israel attacked Iran? Can you imagine this? And if you can, what could be the reason and what would be the flow of events leading to such a development?
Yeah, so I've woken up several times over the last 20 years and change, wondering whether or not that would be the day. So I think I'm as close to having lived the question you're asking as a hypothetical. So I would share this observation. Think about Iran's interest in acquiring weapons of mass destruction, specifically nuclear weapons. President Biden, the Biden-Harris administration has said unequivocally that Iran will not be permitted to have weapons of mass destruction, period. Unequivocal statement. So what goes on alongside that is we've looked at this issue over time. I want you now to think about this through the optics of 4 clocks that are side by side. So one clock is the speed at which Iran is trying to develop weapons of mass destruction. The second clock is the speed at which the international community, previously led by the United States, and hopefully soon will be once again, is using coercive diplomacy to slow down the first clock. The third clock would be the ability of a nation state or a coalition of nation states to kinetically stop the first clock. In other words, blow it up in a strike of some kind. That's the question you just asked. The fourth clock is the clock of regime change. If the regime in Tehran represented the people of Iran and not themselves, you would have a different policy, and that policy would not include developing weapons of mass destruction and threatening Israel. Those are the 4 clocks. The question is, what's the speed of the clocks from the perspective of the United States of America and from the perspective of the government of Israel and from the perspective of the government in Tehran? But that's the answer to the question.
That's very fascinating. And thinking about these 4 clocks running in parallel is a very, very intriguing answer. Now, the next question goes to Matea Caleb. Matea, can we unmute Matea? She's unmuted.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, amazing. Thank you for your time first. And next,
I think she's got a bandwidth issue.
I think, Matea, you're having difficulties with your Wi-Fi.
question is about the USA elections.
Now, can we ask you to try again? Because we haven't heard you. Your Wi-Fi seemed to have been
It cut out.
difficulties. So that is very unfortunate. But then if Matea gets back online, if she gets back online, then we're going to get her a chance to ask the question. Now, in the meantime, I'm going to give the floor to Nina Radonjic.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
If it's okay, I would like that my questions would be directed to both Mr. Rendon and Mr. Jeremic, and that is the future of a Belt and Road initiative in Europe, and would it be able to surpass many obstacles which are on the rise? And the second question would be the book which changed your life, or better to reframe it, the book which had the influence on you. That would be all. Thank you.
John, you go first.
Yeah, because I can't do anything with the second one. So on the first one, the challenge with the Belt and Road initiatives, it seems to be advantaging the ruling elites in each country where a deal has been done. And then they discover that the deal is so intense, they can't get back to what they wanted. So it's really a serious question of understanding what comes with the money, what the roles and responsibilities are for both the party that is receiving the funds and the party that's offering the funds, meaning Beijing. In some cases, it will probably work. In most cases, it has not. And that's why learning from each other becomes really important. In one case, in the boys in Beijing asked for mining rights for 50 years, and the host government thought their mining would start up right away. And what they wanted to do was kill the mining sector. And they haven't started any mining whatsoever. So you have to have really smart negotiators in these deals. But I think Belt and Road, good play to go global, but it's not as advertised. Over to you.
And on the book?
I missed the question about the book.
Nicolina, can you ask it was basically, what is the book that made the greatest influence on you?
That's right.
in your life?
Well,
The Bible?
that's a politically correct answer, but not honest. So there are a number of them that I'm drawn to. So one is Thinking in Time, which was written by Neustadt in May, I don't know, in the 70s, I think, or in the 80s. And the point of that book was, no crisis with which a government is confronted is new. Something has gone on before. It's important to figure out what the similarities are, what the differences are, and then your solution set is bounded by the past. And that's how you find the quickest road to the future. I think that's important to me. And there, I would also commend a number of biographies over time. They're very helpful. It's important to learn from the past, but not try to relive it.
Great answer.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
My take on the Belt and Road, I think it's a great vision. It's potentially the biggest infrastructure development project in human history, and relates to the part of the world's geography that is in dire need for better infrastructure. Now, it has run into difficulties for a number of reasons, and what John mentioned, it was amongst the key reasons why it came under a thicker lens than in the past. But I think that the Chinese are rapidly becoming very aware of the deficiencies, and I think well, since they're not giving up, and this is one of the flagship initiatives of Xi Jinping's presidency, that seems like it's going to last for a while. I think that knowing Chinese also a little bit, their thinking and their culture, I think that they're going to go through the reiterative process of trying to improve what is on the table. But what's also very, very important is this other thing that John mentioned, that countries around the world need to approach projects related to the Belt and Road in a very systemic, well-prepared way, and to negotiate very, very carefully. It's difficult to dismiss the Belt and Road out of hand, especially if you're in a situation like, for example, Serbia. There is no hope that we're ever going to build a railroad of the 21st century, railways of the 21st century, without very generous terms that are being offered through the Belt and Road package. And but one needs to very carefully analyze how it has worked well and not so well in many parts of the world. And I think then with that kind of improvement on both Chinese side and on behalf of a little bit more careful partners on the other side, then we can get to the win-win equilibrium, the win-win being what the Chinese using very often in their communications. And when it comes to the book, of course, the Bible is, they actually teach you in classes at Harvard. If you're asked this question inside a political campaign, you say the Bible. So it's a well-known thing. But to be fully honest, it's The Lord of the Rings. That is the most foundational book that I have ever read about values, about inspirations, about the fact that it is worth fighting a fight even when the enemy is overpowering and very evil, and so on and so forth. I have read many books in my life, but I go back to The Lord of the Rings, believe it or not, very often, even at this day. So The next question goes to Matea, if Matea Caleb managed to reconnect to us.
Yes, hi, I'm sorry. My internet gave up on me at the worst possible time.
All right, go on.
So thank you for your time first. And secondly, my question would be about the USA elections. So we've all been witnesses to a quite turbulent election. And in your opinion, how much did the Trump administration and its attitude towards the pandemic influence the final results of the election and the ultimate victory of Joe Biden, and if it has influenced it at all?
So my personal opinion is it very much influenced it. This election was a vote for or against Donald Trump. It was not necessarily a vote for Joe Biden. And we've talked about it a number of times, particularly looking back over the last 30 days in the United States. So if President Trump had come out of Walter Reed Hospital and said to the country, listen, this virus is serious. You have to wear a mask, stay inside, self-isolate, and social distance if you go out instead of riding around in a car waving to people, he would have been reelected. No question in my mind about that. However, if one looks back now on President and First Lady Biden, Vice President Harris, and Second Gentleman, the event they did last night at the White House to recognize and respect the loss of 500,000 people to the virus is presidential. It's also a unifying characteristic of the Biden-Harris presidency. And they did the same thing the night before the inaugural, on the 19th at the Lincoln Memorial, with 400 candles, now 500. It's recognizing the responsibility a president has to the entire nation. And that's the fundamental difference between the two people. And I don't think it's the Trump administration. I think it was the president personally. Thank you.
Thanks, John. The last question, because we are about the time to finish. The last question goes to Nina Avramovsky.
Hello. So I had a question in the chat, but I just thought of this one, so I wanted to ask it. So given the US's past kind of with meddling and interfering in governments in developing countries, such as in Latin America, I was wondering if you think that the Biden administration should be concerned about China's push to influence developing countries with debt trap diplomacy and methods like that in order to advance on the international stage.
So the real question, does the word meddling indicate a point of view in the formulation of the question?
Well, I just meant by meddling, like historically in Latin American countries and
yeah. So historically, the first structural participation by the government of the United States was in the Kennedy administration and the Alliance for Progress and the Peace Corps, which made a material difference at the local level. The challenge with which Beijing is confronted in Latin America comes from their approach to each of the governments. So, for example, they will do an excellent job of establishing relationships that are either currency-based, more so than social currency, with a number of governments on the expectation that they will provide serious infrastructure funding in that country. And they deserve credit for doing that as long as it is not illegal. They have hurt themselves measurably in the region because of the inability to deliver both credible PPE as promised and as advertised, as well as vaccines as promised and advertised. And then at a much larger political level, the entire region of South America is under threat of destabilization, not from China, but from the conditions inside Venezuela and the Maduro regime. 5 million people have left Venezuela, and they started leaving maybe 4 years ago. And some of those people that left had enough money to buy a home when they arrived in the country to which they were traveling. Everybody that left last week is carrying their home on their back. And 2 million of them are in Colombia. And to President Duque's credit in Colombia, he just said he's going to vaccinate all of them and not draw a distinction, because those people are going through very tough times. The fact that that Beijing, along with Moscow, continues to support Maduro will have a material political effect on their future relationships in the region. Not a single country in South America hasn't been affected by the humanitarian emergency produced by the Maduro regime. So thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you, everybody. And I've left with a bunch of questions, actually not too many, but some of them are very interesting. So I will forward them to John. So I apologize to those who haven't had a chance to participate with their voice in the conversation. But I want to use this opportunity to thank John. It was a fascinating, very interesting discussion as always. Thank you for sharing your views with us. Thank you for being part of the CIRSD Youth Panel Discussion Series. There'll be more to come. I thank you all for joining us and staying with us for 2 consecutive days. We will have John back again in Serbia for sure when the vaccination is done and when he travels again, when he starts traveling again. Thank you for watching. Thank you for.
I should tell everybody this is the longest I've been home in 1/2 of a century. And my final thought, just as you say goodbye to everybody, is may the force be with you always.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, everybody. And we are staying in touch one way or another. Thanks.
Absolutely. Out here.